Hi everyone, just give me a sec to get the screen up and we will be on our way. Okay, here we go. So we're up to part 2. So in part 2 we're now going to discuss how we assess risk and dangerousness. Oh, thought I'd gone too far. Okay, dangerousness is generally related to past violent or serious behaviour and the likelihood of similar conduct. So if people have committed violent acts in the past, then they're statistically more likely to do it again in the future because previous behaviour is a big predictor of future behaviour. So there's 2 activities identified by Hodgins to predict dangerousness. So who will be violent, aggressive or criminal? So do they have the potential to be dangerous? What sort of personality traits do they have? What social situations could they be in that could cause them to become violent? And under what conditions will an individual be violent, aggressive or criminal? So we're talking here about situational factors. Some people are only violent in certain conditions, and if they can be decreased or eliminated, then hopefully the violence will too. And I mention again, some people when they drink alcohol or take drugs will become quite aggressive or even violent. Take away the alcohol and they're pussycats. So looking at what the conditions are under which people will be violent. And clinicians will traditionally overpredict the likelihood, leading to a lot of false positives. They're always going to err on the side of caution because you have to think about what the consequences are for them of getting it wrong. And the legal system comes into that because people will sue. So in order to protect themselves and their own careers, quite often they will err on the side of caution and make a lot of false positives. There are a number of limitations in research. So there's a limited number of risk factors to make predictions. So there are a group of risk factors related to every poor outcome that you can possibly think of. They don't make it happen, but they can be risk factors such as low SES, poor neighbourhood, etc. They don't lead to crime, but they're risk factors, and we need to fall back on them all the time. We tend to fall back on them all the time, but don't look at what happens in between. So we need to improve the research into risk factors. Definitions of violence or dangerousness can vary. So studies will often talk about different definitions or cover different types of violence. So it can be difficult to get a really clear idea on what we're actually talking about. Research design and participant samples. It's really hard to get unbiased samples due to violent people not being a good representation of the whole population. And think about what you've been learning with MyESSA about research design and particularly participant samples. They certainly don't even make up 50% of the population, so it's really hard to get a good sample. And separate studies rarely examined in conjunction with each other and rarely replicated. So a lot of meta-analysis are done and they're good, but with studies rarely being replicated, it means that they are not being demonstrated to be true. Because remember, one of the biggest things with theories and studies is that they have to be replicable and they have to be falsifiable. And if we're not doing that, then we're not getting information that we know to be correct. So what happens is that risk assessments rely on 2 different types of judgment, a clinical judgment and or an actuarial or statistical assessment. So a clinical judgment is, as it said, based on clinical judgment. It's based on what a person thinks, and it can be really subjective. And it can cause an overconfidence and ability to predict. A clinical judgment made by a psychiatrist or a psychologist has a poor record of accuracy and a really big tendency to inflate false positives. And the reasons for this are conservative decision making, so as I said before, erring on the side of caution, an overestimation of base rates, so this assumes more offenders are reconvicted than is true. They ignore the role of situational factors, which is fundamental attribution error, and they explain behaviour based on internal factors such as personality or disposition and underestimate the influence of external factors such as situational influences and what effect they can have on another person's behaviour. So clinical judgment is simply somebody saying, this is what I think. Whereas actuarial prediction is empirically data driven based on characteristics of offenders known statistically to predict reoffending. It's kind of similar to an insurance classification. So it's done by using a checklist, and that you may not even need to see the offender. Remaining ethical concerns are if it is used to inform criminal justice system, there can be some sort of issues around things like ethnicity. What if ethnicity predicts recidivism? Sex, age, parents' education, IQ, all those things need to be taken into account, and sometimes they're not taken into account. So there's been a history of risk assessment. So the first generation was the subjective judgment of professionals. Think here FBI profiling, where it was just a group of FBI agents who got together and they made these subjective judgments of whether people would be criminal or whether they would reoffend. The second generation was where we moved to the actuarial statistical approach. And the third generation, which is more current, is keeping that statistical approach, but introducing dynamic risk factors. So dynamic risk factors are things such as drugs, school problems, which may be subject to change through treatment or some sort of intervention. So here we're trying to look at processes and the way things interact. So this one here is called a linear model or a decision tree. So this is a child protection decision tree to decide how quickly a response will be made. So if you start off with are bruises, contusions or burns evident, or is medical care required? If the answer is yes, then you ask the next question. If the answer to that is yes, then it's a level 1. Will the perpetrator have access to the child? If it's yes, then it becomes level 1. If it's no, it's level 2. And the whole idea here is that level 1 needs to be seen as it said, respond within 24 hours, respond within 48 hours, and level 3, respond within 3 to 5 working days. In reality, the level 3s may get left longer than this due to level 1s and 2s because they just keep on coming. We've seen that there are a lot of children being reported to the department and they are just totally overwhelmed. So children in level 3 may get left for a lot longer. And somewhere in here it says, oh, were severe or bizarre disciplinary measures used? You just got to keep in mind that what may seem to one person to be bizarre or extreme may not to another who might think it's more reasonable. So we just have to take those things into account when we're talking about things like severe or bizarre disciplinary measures. Okay, so this is called the hypothetico-deductive model. This is where we use knowledge about previous behaviour and relevant theories to predict future behaviour. So hypothetico refers to theory and deductive refers to data. You have a theory or hypothesis and you make a prediction, then you design an experiment to test your prediction, perform the experiment and create or modify the theory based on the results. Don't forget, it must always be falsifiable. It needs to be able to be tested and run contrary to the hypothesis. Okay, so make the theory, have a prediction, conduct your experiment, observe the results, create a new theory or modify the one that you've got. These are purely clinical approaches. Then we've got the risk assessment model. So this allows for multi-dimensional nature of violence. Here, we're weighing up the for and against. So the advantage is that it includes things like the environment rather than just focusing on risk factors. The good example in the textbook about a man being released from prison for domestic violence and going to live with his mother is a really good example of how you would use this risk assessment model. So he is released from prison and he goes to live with his mother. That would sound like a really great safety factor. But then when it's taken into account that his ex-partner against whom he committed the violence lives in the next street, all of a sudden there's a hazard factor. And when we find out too that there are siblings living in the house that all have problems with alcohol, which was involved in his case, then it's another hazard factor. Okay, so him going to live with his mother, we could say there are many good things that could be seen from that situation, but there are also factors that will go against him, such as having alcoholic siblings living with his mother and the ex-girlfriend living down the road. So you need to weigh up here the pros and cons, or the for and against. This is a bigger decision type tree. This is a move away from subjectivity to data only. So you can look at many different predictors such as age and personality to see if there are predictors to crime. You would never get, I would never ask you a question on this, but you just need to understand that this is how these decision trees are built. So you can look at many different predictors. I said that bit. This is a regression tree, looking at high school graduates to look at many different variables for this particular cohort. Shows that people with particular characteristics are more likely to behave in a certain way. And I think that you would have to say, looking at this, it's really not very user-friendly. Although with everything, there are people who are real visual people who will look at this and be able to get it and feel fine with it. There are others like me who look at that and go, no, just put it in writing what it all means and then I'll be able to understand it. But this is purely empirically based and statistically based prediction methods. There is nothing that is subjective about this at all. And this is the last one. It's a combination of both. And it's done to try to make it more user-friendly. So this is a form that can be used by police officers, probation officers, and others to make decisions about offenders. So the clinical methods measures include a lot of these things. You've got a psychopathy checklist, the VRAG, and the rapid risk assessment. There's many different ones of these that can be used, including databases where the information is just put in, so you're not physically filling out a form. The categories are drawn from empirical data, but remember, at the end of the day, they rely on the person to tell the truth. So these are the best predictors we currently have, but they're really, really far from perfect. Okay. With the rapid risk assessment, there can be differences in the offender who offend against those they're related to and those they are not related to. So that can be really tricky with a sexual offender, because remember, a lot of their offences are committed against people that they actually know. And research has shown that too. Okay, how do we predict recidivism? Because not all offenders are just as likely to reoffend as each other. So this is what we can use. If you're making a risk assessment, then this is what's commonly used. Horizontally is your prediction. So if you are looking across the page, you will either predict that they will reoffend or you will predict that they will not reoffend. Okay, going down the page is whether they actually do reoffend or whether they do not reoffend. Okay, the most concerning would be getting a false negative, because then you have predicted that they won't reoffend and then they go and reoffend. Okay, so the true and false relates to the horizontal line, the positive and negative relates to the vertical line. So in this case, predicted they will not reoffend, that's false, that's saying they won't. See, I get this very confused, okay? But yes, if you predict that they will not reoffend and then they do reoffend, it's a false negative. False because they have reoffended, and negative because you said they wouldn't. Now I've got it right. True and false goes with the two vertical ones. Positive and negative goes with these. So reoffends is true, does not reoffend is false. Predict they will reoffend is a positive, predict they will not reoffend is a negative. My apologies for confusing you. I get confused too. I'm not above getting confused. So we'll be doing an exercise based on this in the tutorial, so make sure that you have this out and with you at the time. They're not too hard, but we'll have a bit of fun with it. So predicting recidivism, the relevant issues. The predictive accuracy of a test. That means how good is it at getting it right. The sensitivity, correctly identify the true positives. So a sensitive test is one that is good at identifying true positives, and a true positive, remember, is that you have said that they will reoffend, so true, and predicted that they will reoffend, that is true. So it's a sensitive thing. Specificity, a specific test that correctly identifies true negatives and they trade off against each other, okay? Prediction is always easy for common events. So it's really hard to predict events that happen infrequently, such as kidnapping of children. Happens very rarely, holding them for ransom. That's just nothing that we hear of anymore. But it's really, easy for common events such as car stealing at the moment, shoplifting, things like that. Because when it comes to the really rare events, we've just got less information about the characteristics of people committing this crime. So based on the offending rate, you want 50% of the population to have committed the crime to get a good base rate. But you're never going to get that because 50% of the population do not commit any crime. Situational influences play a key role, predicting that most of the time or in general circumstances. But what does that actually mean? Okay, that's the end of part 2. So in part 3, we're going to specifically look at preventative detention and one of Queensland's worst serial rapists. So I'll see you for part 3.